Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Bryan, Executive Director of the Center for Court Innovation. Thank you so much for joining us for this special event. At the Center for Court Innovation, no matter what we do or where we work, we believe in putting people first and elevating the role of the community in defining and delivering safety and justice. And to me, that's what today's discussion is all about. Two reflections of mine on today's topic. First, what we count is what counts. So how can we widen the aperture in criminal justice research so that we measure what matters? And second, we can't only focus on the what, we need to also focus on the how. New thinking and approaches that partner with the community and those whom we seek data from both advances inclusion and equity and leads to more effective research methods and more useful findings.
We've been conducting research in the US and globally on criminal legal system and justice issues on a wide range of topics for over 25 years. And our research broadly falls into two categories. The first is evaluation, where we're looking at the implementation and impact of existing programs and policies and teasing out lessons learned for other jurisdictions or future replications. And the second is exploratory research that tries to answer questions that will help inform the development of future programs and policies. Whenever possible, when resources allow, we try to incorporate into our research designs data collection methods that allow us to hear directly from community members and that amplify their voices and experiences as well. And this could involve running focus groups with youth and restorative justice programs in schools if we're evaluating them, or surveying people about their experiences in court, or interviewing folks in the community about what safety and justice mean to them before we go and design new programming. We've been rethinking how we do research in three key ways. The first is an expansive definition of researcher and expert. When you think about researcher, what comes to mind? Where is that person located? What credentials do they have? What makes them an expert? And when we think of expertise and who can be a researcher, we're often thinking about expertise gained through study in an academic setting, but it's also expertise gained from cultural practices and community history, and experience gained through personal and lived experience. We've made changes to our hiring practices at the center in our research department to reflect these three different forms of expertise to ensure that we have representation from all of them whenever possible. The second way we're rethinking research is through anti-oppressive practices. So we're acknowledging the power that evaluators, I mentioned that a lot of the work that we do is evaluation, acknowledging the power that evaluators have and the ways in which research in the past, especially in the criminal justice field, have legitimated harmful policies. So evaluators hold a lot of power to declare a program successful or not, which ultimately has impact on funding for these programs, whether or not they get expanded or they get cut. That means if they get cut, jobs for program staff and potentially essential services for people. But who decided that those were the most important outcomes that were included in the evaluation? And what are some of the unintended consequences of declaring a program successful or not on those outcomes? So we're really thinking about creating new measures that matter to program staff, to program participants, and affected communities. We're also asking research questions that get at system responsibility for change and not just looking at individuals and whether or not they changed. And more, we're really seeking to understand the root causes of crime and system involvement for many of the program participants that we work with. We're also, in one of our anti-oppressive practices, we're really avoiding damage-centered research that asks people to tell us about their pain and their trauma, but never asks them and highlights their strengths and resilience. And we're really trying to have meaningful engagement with affected communities in multiple stages of our research projects. The third way we're rethinking research is making it action-oriented. So the research process itself and the results are promoting informed and strategic action for positive social change. And we try to disseminate our research to all the stakeholders, including studied populations and formats that are meaningful to them. So traditionally, academic journal articles can't be accessed by the communities that provided the data for us because they're behind paywalls. And so we're trying to think through the different ways that we disseminate our research and to make sure it's more equitable. As a department, we're really embracing participatory research, which is an approach to knowledge creation that intentionally includes members of the community of interest on the research team alongside traditionally trained researchers. So for example, if the project is about why young people carry illegal guns, there are researchers on the team with that lived experience. And when I say lived experience, I'm referring to hiring people as researchers who have the personal and unique perspective that comes with having been affected in some way by the issue being studied. So in this case, young people carrying guns, and understanding that those experiences and the knowledge gained from them and the expertise gained from them are shaped by characteristics such as race, class, and gender. And these researchers are engaged in all stages of the research project. So developing the guiding research questions and determining which is the best way and the best research design to answer those questions and the best sampling frame, to collecting and analyzing the data, to writing up the findings and creating the recommendations and disseminating the work. And this approach has benefits, including for the research, including for participatory researchers and for policymakers in the field. So for the research, we're transforming some of those unequal power dynamics that I talked about in traditional evaluation, and we're asking different research questions. We're creating more culturally responsive data collection materials. We're improving the reliability of measures, and we're increasing access to hard to reach populations, which of course leads to more generalizable findings. We're getting more honest responses, leading to higher quality and more valid data. We're increasing the nuance of an interpretation of our findings, and we're making recommendations that are more reflective of community needs. For participatory researchers, we're providing meaningful jobs for people with lived experience. And for some in our world, working with the criminal legal system, people who have justice involvement face discrimination, accessing jobs. So this is providing them with meaningful jobs. We're building their social capital, teaching research and analytic skills, and offering opportunities for additional skill development and growth of leadership that they can use to then turn to other issues in their community after the research project is over. And for policymakers, we're expanding their access to deep cultural knowledge, typically only accessible to people in network. And that means we have better findings and more reliable information that leads to more effective policies and programs. So some of the center's participatory research projects have included a Department of Justice funded study of pathways into the sex trade, which included a research team comprised of heavily of people who had experience in the sex trade by force or choice or circumstance. A study of why young New Yorkers carry guns, which included researchers who had significant street experience and deep cultural knowledge of gang networks. And with that study, for example, we would never have been able to access over 300 young gun carriers without the team being comprised of people with different forms of expertise than traditionally trained researchers like myself. We tried it, it didn't work. We faced significant challenges in gaining the trust and candid responses from the heavily street involved youth, which is unsurprising given the sensitive nature of the questions regarding guns and gangs and violence. So we had to hire researchers to conduct the interviews and be the public face of the project who had significant personal experience in the social networks of the target population. And so beyond merely ensuring access, this approach also led us to have more honest engagement from the interviewees, which led to more accurate analysis and interpretation of the data.
I am Dean Mandy, and I run a program called the Youth Action Institute, formerly known as the Youth Justice Board, but in the spirit of being more participatory, being more in line with our values, we reinvented ourselves as the Youth Action Institute. And we are essentially a public policy research fellowship for young New Yorkers ages 16 to 21, focused particularly on how young people experience public safety in New York City. And we're defining public safety in this framework as any person's ability to participate in public life with agency, dignity, and safety. So for young people, what this means is that in addition to looking at traditional legal systems like juvenile policing and foster care, we're also spending a lot of time looking at school systems and recreation systems, right? Like, where are young people engaging in public life and how are they doing it? And is it safe for them to do so? We also are a leadership development program. So we are supporting young people in being thoughtful, generous, and responsible with power and knowledge and the power that comes from knowledge. We support young people in determining their specific leadership identity and in practicing leadership styles within non-hierarchical communities. And then finally, we are a social justice community. So we build knowledge within and connection between young people who care deeply about social justice for a variety of reasons, and support them in determining future pathways for their growth as social justice advocates and experts. The work that our young people do is usually within 5 particular columns, areas. So primarily is the training and skill building work. So we're training in research, both traditional research and transformative research, policy and how policy works, what is its purpose, what are the nuances of it, and then, of course, foundationally anti-oppression practices. There is a ton of background research that goes into the work that they do. So they are doing more traditional, reading of articles, searching of things, learning how to read data charts. But they're also doing more new age research. So, viewing, viewing different forms of media that talk about the issue that they're engaged in, listening to podcasts about the issue that they're focused on, listening to just all types of different voices that add nuance to the issue that they're focused on. They also do research interviewing, so they're asking questions of experts, including impacted people other than themselves, to gain deeper insight into the problem. And then finally, the other two parts that our young people engage in is dialogue with leaders. So connecting with community leaders and elected leaders to learn more about the history of solutions that have been tried for the issue that they're focused on, as well as the potential future for those solutions. And then finally, they're using all of that information to craft new, equitable, and particularly youth-centered solutions. So what is the solution that actually works for the young people in the program? And will that work for all of the young people that they've talked to? If not, why not? How do they modify it from there? So that's, I guess, the foundation of what we do. It was twofold. So one is an ideals-focused element. I think I mentioned that it brought us further into alignment with our values. To be a program that values experience as expertise in our data, we also need to be doing that in our recruitment and cohort design. And then in a practical element, we can get deeper into an issue faster with the participatory framework. Rather than doing, extended laborious teaching of foundational concepts, we get to do understanding checks. So, what does it mean to be queer in school, rather than having to go through, so here's the full alphabet, and let's go through all these identities, right? We're going straight to, like, what does it mean for you? How do we, what even is queerness? What is the foundation of what that means? So yeah, it is both values and time efficiency. One of the things that I love about PAR is that it often produces bolder solutions, particularly in working with young people. They are at the peak of creativity. And so when they come up with a solution, it is rooted in a vision for transformation rather than a vision for modification. So just bigger, bolder, brighter ideas. With young people, what I found is that there's also a consistent emphasis on educating others about the issue as a necessary step in solving the problem, right? Young people deeply understand that nothing gets solved in a vacuum or in a bubble. And particularly the young people that I'm working with are extremely thoughtful about their own position as young people as a transient stage. And so who's coming behind them? What's happening for the next set of young people? And how are we setting a foundation for the next set of young people to engage in this solutions work? And then finally, with PAR, as a framework, the process itself is a finding. So how did people engage? How are they supported in engaging? What tangible changes has this work produced in participants' lives? And what did we learn about the issue through the challenges that the group faced? That in and of itself is so illuminating, even though it can be very, very difficult to move through.
Our work started off as a study for young gun carriers in New York City. This was your traditional research. In this research, we interviewed 330 shooters. And this is different from the first of its kind, right? And in that 330 shooters in NYC, we did that in Brooklyn, Brownsville, we did that in East Harlem and Marcenia, Bronx. When I first got brought onto this project, I was brought on as security. So I was watching over the academic trained team that was gathering and engaging this population. But I noticed certain challenges that they had because they didn't have no insight on gun culture or gang or even gang culture. For me, I understood the topic I studied and how they applied to me and the guys that I was running with in the street with their street lived experience. I was able and fortunate to move up to researcher where I was trained in research methods and research skills such as quantitative data, RDS, response, dribbling, sampling, and survey design. With survey design, I had the opportunity on this study to change the survey relating to the population that we was engaging, meaning I was switching the language so they understand basically what we was trying to get across and how it could benefit them and their community in the long run. Before that, I was also able to change the team, right? Fit in the image of the population that we were trying to engage. The academic team was how they was coming, how just the image of their engagement was definitely a challenge and had created limits to the engagement. Once we was able to change that, we was able to hit the streets and the streets that we was, the parts of the streets that we was in and the topic that we were studying, it had opened up these conversations because the team had the image and the street lived experience for the population. And it opened up this, this thing where I could say participants was vulnerable to talk about their past and their present and the things that they did in their neighborhood and how damaging and how beneficial it was at the time. But it also created and motivated them to want to give back into their neighborhood and want to do something. Unfortunately, this project needed an action component and didn't have one. But we was able to transition and get a 4-city site grant. And this gun study was a full PAR study, right? And our goal was to interview 600 shooters nationally and 150 each state. This PAR project allowed the PAR researchers be in all parts and phase of the design and fundraising of the current 4-city site. The actions are written into the proposal, and those 4 cities are Crown Heights, Brooklyn, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, and Detroit. Our action component for NY included the design of activities and a safe space for the gun carriers we was engaging. And those activities look like paintball, Afro-punk, and cookouts and block parties. And we was able to bring these 2 blocks that normally wouldn't come together with the networks that's based in the communities. And I'm talking about the street networks, such as your Bloods, your Crips, and then your local block gangs was able to come together doing this action and be very successful there. In our early data analysis, we discovered and found and developed a list of gun carriers. This list consists of caring for image, caring for hustling, caring for protection, and shooters. In our fieldwork experience, which was showing up in the first project, now showing up in the second project nationally, that these young men wanted to be engaged, but in a specific way and by a specific person. I would say in my experience on the street and as a cure violence interrupter, these different type of supports was needed and needed for each level of gun carrying. I would say most programs focus on gun carriers, but they focus on caring for protection or caring for image. For these 2 gun studies, we created a model called the HEIST that served and support and redirect the levels of gun carriers, understanding the culture of guns and understanding the neighborhood and community that they was in and where we was engaging and doing that on a network by network encountering. The HEIST is designed for shooters, right? The HEIST is a gun violence reduction program that has 4 levels to it: community safety, relationship building, trust and protection, and healing. We're looking to pilot and evaluate this model. when it's done right, when PAR is done right, it pushes us past each patterns and solutions that come from cultural outsiders, right? That doesn't fit in how the community defines itself. I would say in the gun violence and the violence prevention world, credible messengers is a term that policies and researchers love. But to gun carriers and shooters in particular that don't understand or relate to that type of language, this limits programs, research for fully engaging the population they're trying to serve. And I would say if the real goal is community safety, right, you have to understand and address why people are using guns, not just the existence of guns in their community. A lot of these issues of safety that we're throwing at for designing programs for involves populations that are closed and very difficult to fully understand from outsiders. PAR allows these closed communities to say, here are the rules you need to understand and respect to engage us, right? PAR gives us the language and the insider framework for encountering communities that gives these populations the power they need to define who they are, how they are, and what they need.
Yes, it does come up almost every time that we're talking about participatory action research. I think what people need to understand is that you're actually using the same methods that you would in other, more traditional research projects. So you're still using quantitative and qualitative data collection methods such as focus groups and surveys and interviews and downloading, administrative data. You're using the same methods. First of all, I guess we want to think about like who set that criteria for rigor and scientific rigor, and when was it set and by whom, and who was excluded from those conversations historically. But so just kind of, and I think PAR offers an interesting thought experiment for us to kind of think about why we're so wed to that idea of scientific rigor and what academics have been trained over the years, at least in Western science, to think about as rigorous. But PAR is really a building block, first step that isn't at all in opposition to Western scientific rigor. It does offer like us a way to think about what measures are we talking about, and what are our research questions, and involving all that different kinds of expertise that I was talking about, the academic expertise, the expertise from personal and lived experience, and the expertise from community history and knowledge that has been created over decades, sometimes hundreds of years, and using that to inform the research questions and the design, and then the data collection tools that become much more culturally responsive. So it's not actually in opposition with that. I think it actually lends itself to more valid and more reliable data and analysis. And when we think about research, we have to think about three things, like the quality of the data collection, the quality of the data analysis, and the quality of how we communicate the findings back. Because if we have really great data collection and not good analysis, our findings and recommendations aren't going to be good. If we don't have good data collection tools, our findings aren't going to be necessarily valid. And if we can't communicate the findings to the various audiences in the ways in which they can best understand it, we're really limiting the research that we're doing. So in fact, I would say that PAR makes everything more rigorous, and also challenges us to think through the assumptions that we've brought to the table as traditional researchers. With participatory research, you're trying to include people as researchers and hire them as researchers who are impacted by the topic that is being studied. So the ways in which we recruited people for the study on pathways into the sex trade, where we were trying to recruit people who had lived experience in the sex trade by force, by circumstance, by choice, was very different from the ways in which we recruited people for the Why Young People Carry Guns study, participatory research study. So for instance, for the gun study, as Basim kind of mentioned, he had been working as a violence interrupter at a cure violence program. And we went originally to that program to just say like, hey, here, we've already developed our instrument. We've got our team. And can you take a look at this? And, he and some other folks from a cure of violence program that were staff members gave really significant feedback that improved the interview instrument significantly. And from that, we said, hey, maybe Basim would like to come on as, and he mentioned as security for the project at the start. And then from there, it kind of snowballed into, we need, him on the research team doing this work. And then he was able to identify some of the other gaps and say, like, we need somebody with this experience who might be pretty outgoing and can walk up to people and access them, for recruitment purposes. And so then he was able to bring people in from his network and that's how it went out from that, in order to recruit the people with lived experience. For the sex trade study, it was a little bit different. We went to a couple of advocacy organizations who worked with people who were in the sex trade, some health focused work, as well as talking to people who had, been working with the Human Trafficking Intervention Court in New York City. And they were able to identify other people who they had worked with who had different experiences than the people who were part of the advocacy group. And from there, it went through a couple of referrals. There was somebody we recruited from a connection to an organization called Streetwise and Safe, who had also done some work, especially around youth of color who were involved in the sex trade. And we were able to try to recruit people with lived experience of very diverse lived experience that we know exists with in the sex trade.
I hope today, even if it was just scratching the surface, gave you a sense of how we're rethinking research at the center and why and how that is driving not just our approach to research, but as Basim really emphasized, our approach to practice on the ground. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank our colleague Elise White for her thought partnership, both on the panel and her leadership in our attempt to rethink and reanimate research day to day at the center. I would also say that if you're interested in supporting any of the projects or approaches you heard about during today's panel, to reach out to any of us to discuss that further. We would welcome those conversations, welcome that engagement. This isn't goodbye, it's to be continued. And thank you so much for joining us.